Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into something that demands both your attention and your respect. We're going deep into the plantation system, and specifically into the machinery of terror that kept it running. The brutal punishment methods used to break the bodies and spirits of enslaved people. This isn't comfortable history. This isn't the kind of thing that gets taught in most classrooms. But it's real, it's documented, and it's essential to understanding what slavery actually was. Not some abstraction, but a daily reality of violence, control, and survival against impossible odds. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious to see who's joining us from around the world, especially for a topic this heavy. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get yourself settled. Maybe wrap up in something warm, because tonight we're going somewhere cold, not in temperature, but in the calculated cruelty that defined an entire economic system built on human suffering. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever really thought about what it meant to be punished on a plantation? Not in some vague historical sense, but in specific, physical, documented detail. What did it feel like when the overseer called your name? What sounds filled the air on a plantation morning when someone was being made an example of? Did the other enslaved people have to watch? Were they forced to participate? What happened to your body, to your mind? How did people survive punishments designed to destroy them? And perhaps most importantly, how did those who endured this violence find ways to maintain their dignity, their humanity, their sense of self, when every instrument of power was designed to strip it away? Congratulations. You've just woken up in the year 1842, somewhere in the Deep South. Your property, your body belongs to someone else. And today, someone on this plantation has been judged guilty of something. Maybe something as small as moving too slowly, or as dangerous as learning to read. Either way, everyone is about to be reminded of the rules. Welcome to the economics of terror. The first thing you need to understand is that plantation punishment wasn't random cruelty. It wasn't the result of individual slaveholders having bad days or particularly vicious temperaments, though plenty of them did. Punishment on the plantation was systematic. It was calculated. It was, in the coldest possible sense, a business decision. Every lash, every branding, every hour spent in the stocks was designed to accomplish specific goals: maximum labor extraction, absolute obedience, and the complete psychological domination of human beings who outnumbered their captors, sometimes by margins of 10 to 1. Think about that for a moment. You're a slaveholder in Mississippi in 1842. You own a cotton plantation with maybe 300 enslaved people. There's you, your wife, your children, an overseer, and maybe a few hired hands. That's it. That's the entire white population on your property, surrounded by hundreds of people who have every reason in the world to rise up, to run, to fight back. How do you maintain control? Not through kindness, not through fair treatment. You maintain control through the strategic application of terror. The slaveholders' dilemma was this: you needed healthy workers to maximize profit, but you also needed terrified workers to prevent rebellion. Punishment had to be severe enough to instill absolute fear, but not so severe that it permanently damaged your investment. An enslaved person was worth money, sometimes a great deal of money, and destroying them completely meant destroying your own capital. So the system developed a cruel calculus, a mathematics of suffering calibrated to maximize both terror and productivity. Every plantation operated according to unwritten rules, about what merited punishment and how severe that punishment should be. The offences ranged from the genuinely defiant, running away, fighting back, organising resistance, to the utterly arbitrary, not picking cotton fast enough, making eye contact with a white person, laughing too loudly, moving with insufficient urgency. The punishment could come for anything or nothing. That was part of the point. The unpredictability itself was a tool of control. You wake before dawn, like every other day. The horn sounds, and you're on your feet before the echo fades. You've learned that lesson already. Today feels different though. There's a tension in the air, a silence where there should be the quiet sounds of people preparing for another day of labor. You step outside your cabin, and you see people gathering near the whipping post. The post itself is nothing special, just a wooden beam sunk into the earth, maybe 8 feet tall, with iron rings bolted near the top. You've seen it before. Everyone has. Some of you have been tied to it. Today it's not you. Today you're a witness, and being a witness is its own kind of punishment. The overseer stands nearby, coiling the whip in his hands, not hurrying, taking his time, letting everyone gather, letting the anticipation build. He's learned that half the punishment is the waiting, the watching, the forced acknowledgement that this could be you, that this will be you if you step out of line. The victim is brought forward. Maybe it's someone you know, someone you've shared meals with, someone whose children play with your children. Maybe it's a stranger from another part of the plantation. It doesn't matter. The ritual is the same. Their shirt is removed. Their wrists are bound to those iron rings, stretched above their head so their back is exposed, so every muscle is pulled taut. The position itself is agony, even before the first blow falls. Here's the thing about the whip that the history books often skim past. There were different kinds. The bull whip, the cowhide, the cat and nine tails, the paddle. Each one left different marks, caused different kinds of pain, served different purposes. The bull whip, long and tapered, could be wielded with such precision that a skilled user could cut specific patterns into flesh, could wrap around a body and strike areas the victim couldn't protect. The cowhide was shorter, thicker, designed for blunt trauma as much as cutting. The cat o' nine tails had multiple strands, each one leaving its own welt, multiplying the damage with every stroke. Some overseers took pride in their technique. They practiced. They refined their swing. They learned exactly how much force was needed to split skin without damaging muscle, to cause maximum pain while minimizing recovery time. Because again, this was a business. A worker recovering from a severe whipping was a worker not in the fields. The ideal was punishment savage enough to traumatize everyone who witnessed it, precise enough to allow the victim back to work within days. The sound of the whip is something survivors describe decades later with perfect clarity. It starts with a whistle, a high-pitched singing through the air, followed by a crack that echoes off buildings, off trees, off the silence of forced witnesses. Then comes the involuntary cry, the gasp, the attempt to brace for the next blow, while still processing the shock of the last one. 20 lashes, 30, 50, 100. The numbers were assigned based on the perceived severity of the offense, but also on the whim of whoever was doing the assigning. Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery and became one of the most powerful voices for abolition, wrote about watching his aunt being whipped when he was a child. He described the blood running down her back, her screams, and his own helpless terror as he hid and watched. He called it the blood-stained gate through which he entered the hell of slavery. That was his introduction to what his life would be. That was what the system wanted every enslaved child to understand. This is what awaits you. But the whip was only the beginning. It was the most common punishment, yes, but the plantation's arsenal of cruelty went far beyond leather and skin. The stocks were a holdover from earlier centuries, but they found new purpose on the plantation. Imagine having your wrists and neck locked into holes cut in heavy wooden boards, forced to stand or sit in a hunched position for hours, sometimes days. Your muscles cramp, your joints swell, the blood pools in your extremities until your hands go numb and then start to throb with a pain that seems to pulse with your heartbeat. You can't sit, you can't stand properly, you can't lie down. You're exposed to the sun, to the rain, to the insects that feast on your sweat, and any open wounds. And everyone walks past you, everyone sees you. That's the point. Some plantations had dedicated structures for punishment. The jail, they might call it, or the correction house. These were small buildings, sometimes just single rooms, designed for the extended punishment of enslaved people who were deemed particularly troublesome. Inside you might find chains bolted to walls, devices for stretching limbs, buckets of brine to throw on fresh wounds, and tools whose purposes you didn't want to imagine. These weren't dungeons from the Middle Ages. These were structures built in America in the 1830s, the 1840s, the 1850s, while the Constitution promised liberty and newspapers debated the expansion of democracy. The creativity of cruelty is one of the most disturbing aspects of this history. Slaveholders and overseers developed variations on punishment that reflected both their sadism and their economic calculations. There was the practice of staking out, where an enslaved person would be stretched on the ground, wrists and ankles tied to stakes, completely immobilized and exposed. In this position, whippings could be administered to the back, the legs, the feet. In summer, the sun would bake the victim's skin. In winter, the cold would seep into their bones. The psychological component was as important as the physical. You are utterly helpless, completely at our mercy, and we have no mercy. There was the thumbscrew, exactly what it sounds like, a device that crushed the thumb slowly, incrementally, the pain building and building, until the victim would confess to anything, agree to anything, do anything to make it stop. There were iron collars fitted with bells, so that any enslaved person who tried to run would announce their location with every step. These collars might have prongs extending outward, making it impossible to lie down, making it difficult to move through brush or woods. The message was clear. Even the thought of escape will bring you suffering. There was the practice of pickling. And here I need to warn you, this is difficult to hear, but it's documented, it's historical, and it's part of understanding what this system actually was. After a severe whipping, when the skin was torn and bleeding, some slaveholders would pour salt water or brine, or even spirits into the wounds. The official justification was that this would promote healing, prevent infection. The actual effect was agony beyond description. Survivors wrote about this practice with horror that persisted decades later. Some speculated that the real purpose was not healing at all, but extending the punishment, turning minutes of whipping into hours or days of ongoing torture. The economics of punishment extended to pregnant women. This is where the system's contradictions became most visible and most obscene. Enslaved women were valued not just for their labor, but for their reproductive capacity. Every child they bore was another piece of property for the slaveholder, more wealth, more labor, more power. So when a pregnant woman needed to be punished, the system had to find a way to hurt her without potentially damaging the fetus she was carrying, the future property she represented. The solution, documented across multiple plantations and in testimony from survivors, was this: A hole would be dug in the ground, and the pregnant woman would be made to lie face down with her belly in the hole. This protected the unborn child while leaving her back fully exposed for whipping. Read that again. Let it sink in. They dug holes in the ground to protect their investment while brutalizing a human being. They wanted to preserve the baby so they could enslave it, while teaching its mother that her body was never her own. This detail appears in narratives and records from across the South. It wasn't rare. It wasn't aberrant. It was a standard practice, developed and refined to solve the problem of how to torture pregnant women without destroying potential future property. The hole in the ground tells you everything you need to know about how the system viewed enslaved people as valuable animals worth maintaining, never worth treating as human. Children were not exempt from punishment. In fact, their punishment served a particular purpose. It taught them early and thoroughly what their lives would be. A child of 5 or 6 might be whipped for a minor offense, for breaking a dish, for failing to complete a task, for being a child in a system that had no room for childhood. The goal was to break them before they ever fully formed, to make obedience so deeply ingrained that resistance would never occur to them. Former enslaved people's narratives are filled with memories of childhood punishments, their own and others. They remember watching older siblings whipped, watching parents humiliated and brutalized, understanding with a clarity that no child should ever have to bear, that this was their future, that there was no growing out of it, no escape, no protection. The visibility of punishment was essential to its function. Whippings were public. They were scheduled, announced, attended. Enslaved people were often required to watch, to assemble and stand in rows while someone they knew was tortured in front of them. This wasn't incidental. It was core to the system. Every public punishment was a lesson. Every cry of pain was a warning. Every scar was a message written on human flesh. This is what happens. Some slaveholders developed rituals around punishment that extended its psychological impact. They might require the victim to thank them afterward, to acknowledge that the punishment was deserved, to verbalize submission even as their back was bleeding. They might require other enslaved people to administer punishments, forcing them to hurt their own family members, their own friends, creating guilt and fracturing community bonds. They might delay punishment, letting the anticipation build for days, letting everyone know that something was coming without knowing when. There's a particular cruelty to anticipation. When punishment was announced but not immediately delivered, the victim spent hours, sometimes days, waiting for what was coming. Every moment was spent imagining the pain, the humiliation, the aftermath. Sleep became impossible. Eating became impossible. The punishment began long before the first lash fell. The system understood psychology in ways that were centuries ahead of their time. They knew that inconsistency bred fear. So punishments were sometimes arbitrary, sometimes capricious, designed to keep everyone off balance. They knew that public humiliation was as powerful as physical pain. So punishments often included elements designed to degrade, stripping someone naked, forcing them into humiliating positions, mocking them while they suffered. They knew that forcing people to participate in each other's punishments would erode community bonds. So they created roles: the person who held the victim's legs, the person who counted the strokes, the person who brought the water afterward. And they knew that family bonds were both a source of strength and a vulnerability. Threatening to hurt, sell, or separate family members was one of the most effective forms of control. You might endure any punishment for yourself, but could you endure watching your child suffer? Could you resist if resistance meant your wife would be sold away, your mother beaten, Your father worked to death. This is the context you have to hold in your mind when you think about plantation punishment. It was never just about the individual victim. It was about everyone. Every punishment sent ripples through the entire enslaved community, reminding everyone of their powerlessness, their vulnerability, the absolute control that the system held over every aspect of their lives and bodies. But here's what the slaveholders never fully understood, what they couldn't understand because it would have undermined everything they believed. The people they were brutalizing were fully human, with inner lives as rich and complex as their own. And humans are remarkably resilient. The same minds that experienced terror and trauma also found ways to resist, to survive, to maintain dignity in conditions designed to strip it away. Resistance took countless forms. Some were dramatic, running away, fighting back, organizing rebellions. These were rare because they were so dangerous, because the consequences for failure were so severe. But they happened. The Nat Turner Rebellion, the countless individual escapes, the Underground Railroad. Every one of these was an act of profound courage, a willingness to risk torture and death for the chance at freedom. But most resistance was smaller, quieter, woven into the fabric of daily life. It was the deliberate slowing of work when the overseer wasn't watching. It was the tools that mysteriously broke, the crops that somehow didn't yield as much as expected. It was the songs sung in the fields, coded with messages, preserving stories and hopes and plans. It was the names given in secret, the languages preserved despite prohibition, the religious practices maintained underground. It was the simple fact of waking up each morning and continuing to exist, to love, to hope, to plan for a future that the system said would never come. The spirituals that enslaved people sang, the ones we still know today, were often coded. When they sang about crossing the Jordan, they meant crossing the Ohio River to freedom. When they sang about following the drinking gourd, they meant following the Big Dipper north. These songs were preserved despite being forbidden, passed down despite the danger, proof that the inner life could not be whipped out of a person, no matter how brutal the punishment. Every act of kindness within the enslaved community was a form of resistance. When someone shared food with a hungry neighbor, that was resistance. When someone tended the wounds of a person who'd been whipped, that was resistance. When parents taught their children skills, when they told them stories about who they'd been before, when they preserved any scrap of culture or identity or humanity, that was resistance. The slaveholders wanted atomized individuals, stripped of connection, competing against each other for scraps of favor. What they got, again and again, was community. Imperfect, strained, sometimes fractured, but real. We should also talk about the overseers, because they occupy a particular place in this system. The overseer was the person who actually administered most of the physical punishment on a plantation. He was the one with the whip in his hand, the one whose job it was to extract maximum labor through terror. Slaveholders could maintain a certain distance, could pretend to benevolence while hiring men to do their violence for them. Overseers were usually lower-class white men, often with few prospects beyond this work. They were paid to be brutal, evaluated on their ability to produce results, and given tremendous power over the enslaved people under their supervision. The position attracted a certain type of person, though it also probably created that type of person. It's hard to spend years hurting people without becoming someone who hurts people. But overseers were also in a precarious position. If they were too lenient, they'd be fired for not extracting enough labor. If they were too brutal, they might damage the slaveholders' property, reduce the workforce's capacity, maybe even trigger the kind of resistance that everyone feared. They walked a line, and different men walked it differently. Some overseers appear in the historical record as outright sadists, men who took pleasure in inflicting pain, who went far beyond what even the system considered necessary. Others appear as more calculating, brutal by job description, but not by personal inclination, delivering punishment as a business function rather than a passion. A few, a very few, appear to have quietly sabotaged the system in small ways, looking the other way when they could, warning people when they could. Most were simply men doing a job, which is perhaps the most disturbing thing of all. They went home at night, they had families, they went to church on Sunday, and on Monday they picked up the whip again. The banality of evil, that phrase from the 20th century, applies perfectly to the 19th century plantation. Most of the people who made this system work were not monsters. They were ordinary men who made ordinary choices within an extraordinary system of horror. The same could be said of the slaveholders themselves, though they bore the ultimate responsibility. Some were personally cruel, hands-on in their brutality. Others maintained distance, delegating violence while enjoying its fruits. Many genuinely believed, or convinced themselves to believe, that they were benevolent, that their enslaved workers were content, that the punishment they authorized was necessary and even kindly, like disciplining children. The human capacity for self-delusion is extraordinary. Letters and diaries from slaveholders often portray themselves as burdened caretakers, struggling with the responsibility of managing a dependent population. They complain about the difficulty of finding good overseers, about the ingratitude of their property, about the challenges of maintaining order. They express shock and hurt when enslaved people run away, describing it as betrayal, as if these people owed them loyalty, as if the relationship was anything other than captivity. These documents are painful to read, not because they reveal unique monsters, but because they reveal how completely the system warped the humanity of everyone within it. The slaveholders couldn't see what they were doing because the system made it invisible to them. The violence was normalized, the property relationship accepted, the humanity of enslaved people denied so consistently that many slaveholders genuinely couldn't perceive it. And yet, the violence was real regardless of how it was perceived by those who inflicted it. The bodies bore the marks, the scars remained for life, telling stories that words couldn't always express. Every scar was a map. Former enslaved people who escaped and made it to freedom often had their backs photographed, their scars documented as evidence of what the system actually was. These photographs were used by abolitionists to counter the Southern narrative of happy, well-treated slaves. "Look at this," they said. "Look at what was done. Tell me again about benevolent masters. Tell me again about contented bondspeople." The most famous of these photographs shows a man known as Gordon, who escaped from a Louisiana plantation and reached Union lines during the Civil War. The image of his back, covered in raised and twisted scars, became one of the most powerful pieces of anti-slavery evidence ever produced. Those scars were the record of repeated whippings over years, layer upon layer of healed and reopened wounds, a topography of suffering that required no translation. But Gordon's scars were not unusual. They were typical. Every plantation produced backs like his, produced the visible evidence of what the system required. The scars were so common that they were used in runaway advertisements, listed alongside other identifying characteristics: about 5 feet 8 inches, dark complexion, scarred on back. The very documents meant to recapture escapees inadvertently documented the system's brutality. Let's talk about what happened to the mind, because punishment wasn't just about the body. The psychological components were deliberate and calculated. Post-traumatic stress, depression, anxiety, survivor's guilt. These are modern terms for ancient experiences. Enslaved people lived with constant, unrelenting trauma, and the effects accumulated over years, over generations. Imagine knowing that at any moment, for any reason or no reason at all, you could be subjected to severe physical pain. Imagine that this threat hung over every day of your life, that there was no safe space, no moment of true relaxation, no guarantee of bodily integrity. Imagine watching people you love endure this, being unable to protect your own children, knowing that the people with power over you could hurt anyone you cared about with complete impunity. This is the psychological reality of slavery. The physical punishments, brutal as they were, operated within this constant psychological pressure. Every day was an exercise in survival, in reading the moods of overseers, in staying invisible, in navigating a system designed to destroy your sense of self. Some people broke under this pressure. The historical record includes cases of what we would now recognize as severe mental illness brought on by the conditions of enslavement. People who stopped speaking, who seemed to retreat into themselves, who couldn't function. The system had names for these conditions, medical-sounding terms that blamed the enslaved person rather than the system. Drapetomania was coined as a supposed mental illness that caused slaves to run away, as if the desire for freedom was a disease rather than the most basic human impulse. But most people didn't break. Most people found ways to endure, to maintain some core of self, some capacity for joy and love and hope, even within conditions designed to crush all of these. This resilience shouldn't be romanticized, shouldn't be used to minimize what was endured, but it should be acknowledged. The slaveholders wanted to create automatons, laboring machines stripped of everything that made them human. They failed. Again and again they failed. The failure of the system to completely break the spirits of the enslaved is one of the great testimonies to human resilience in all of history. Despite everything, there was laughter in the quarters. There was love. There were families held together against all odds. There were traditions maintained, songs sung, stories told. There was the simple, radical act of continuing to be human in a system that denied humanity. This is not to say that everyone emerged unscathed. The trauma of slavery echoed through generations. The psychological wounds, like the physical ones, were passed down, affecting how people related to themselves, to each other, to the world. The effects of this violence didn't end with emancipation. They continued, transmuted into new forms, embedded in laws and customs and attitudes that persisted long after the formal institution was abolished. But tonight, right now, we're in 1842, and the overseer is still coiling that whip. The sun is coming up. The morning air is cool but warming. You can smell the dew on the fields and the smoke from the kitchen where breakfast is being prepared for people in the big house who will never know what it's like to stand where you're standing, watching what you're watching. The first blow falls. The sound reaches you before you can close your eyes. The crack of leather on skin, the involuntary cry, the shuffling of feet as people around you flinch and look away, and then look back, because not watching could itself be punished. You are expected to witness. This is for you as much as for the person tied to that post, maybe more. You count the strokes because that's what you do. It gives your mind something to hold on to, something to focus on besides the sounds and the knowledge that could be. You could be your mother, could be your child, could be anyone you love at any moment for any reason. The numbers climb. 10, 15, 20. The victim's voice changes from sharp cries to something lower, a sound that comes from deeper in the body, the sound of someone who has moved past the initial shock and settled into enduring. Blood appears at some point. You don't want to note when, but you do. The whip is finding the same places, deepening the cuts, the skin splitting where it's already been split, the blood mixing with sweat and running in thin streams down bare skin. The overseer continues with the same rhythm, unhurried, professional. This is his job. This is Tuesday. When it's over, the victim is untied and falls forward. Someone catches them. Someone is always there to catch them, to help them to the shade, to give them water, to begin the process of cleaning and binding wounds. The community does this, takes care of its own, resists the atomization that the system wants. But everyone knows this isn't over. Tomorrow the victim will be expected back in the fields. Those wounds will reopen. The healing will be incomplete. And 3 months from now, 3 years from now, 3 decades from now, the scars will still be there. The body's testimony to what was done. You return to your work. There's no time to process, no space for grief or rage or any of the emotions that fill you. The cotton needs picking. The rows are long. The sun is climbing. The overseer is watching. Life continues, which is to say, survival continues. And somewhere inside you, in a place that the whip can't reach, something remains intact. Your memory of who you are, where you came from, who your people were before all this, your love for the people around you, your dreams, whatever they might be, of a different life, a free life, a life where your body belongs to you. These things are hidden, protected, nurtured in secret. The system wants to destroy them. The system fails. That's the story that rarely gets told. Not just the horror, which was real and must be remembered, but the survival, which was equally real and equally important. The people who endured slavery were not passive victims. They were survivors. They were resistors. They were fully human beings exercising every form of agency available to them within a system designed to allow none. And their survival, their resilience, their continued humanity is as much a part of this history as the violence that tried to destroy it. But the day is just beginning. There's more to tell you about how this system worked, the specialized tortures, the psychological refinements, the ways that punishment was woven into every aspect of plantation life. And there's more to tell you about how people survived, what they held on to, how they maintained the inner lives that the system could never fully reach. The sun is higher now. The fields are waiting. And somewhere in the quarters, someone is quietly singing. A song that sounds like one thing and means another. A song that carries coded information, preserved memory, forbidden hope. The overseers think it's just music. They have no idea. Now let's talk about the punishments that went beyond the whip, because the plantation's arsenal of cruelty was disturbingly inventive. Slaveholders and overseers developed methods designed for specific situations, specific offenses, specific messages they wanted to send. The whip was the standard, the everyday, the baseline. But for certain infractions, for certain people, for certain lessons that needed teaching, there were other tools. Branding was one of the oldest and most permanent forms of punishment. The practice stretched back centuries, borrowed from the marking of livestock, applied to human beings with the same cold logic. A hot iron pressed against skin, leaving a permanent scar that identified you forever as someone who had transgressed, someone who had tried to run, someone who had been punished and would bear the evidence for life. The locations of brands were chosen deliberately. The face was common for repeat runaways, a mark that couldn't be hidden. that announced your history to everyone who saw you. The shoulder, the arm, the chest. Each location visible in certain circumstances, hidden in others, but always there, always part of your body's story. Some slaveholders had custom brands made, their initials seared into human flesh, like a signature on property. The pain of branding was intense but brief compared to the whip. The lasting damage was psychological as much as physical. You carried the mark. You couldn't remove it. Every time you looked at that scarred tissue, every time someone else saw it, you were reminded of what had happened, of your status, of the system's power over your body. Branding was a form of permanent communication, a message written on skin that said, "This person belongs to me, and this person has been punished." But branding was relatively rare compared to other methods. It permanently marked valuable property, and it could reduce resale value if the enslaved person was ever sold. The system preferred punishments that caused intense suffering, but left bodies capable of labor, and if necessary, capable of being sold without obvious signs of extreme abuse. This brings us to the paddle, sometimes called the bat or the board. It was exactly what it sounds like, a flat piece of wood, sometimes with holes, drilled through it to reduce air resistance and increase the force of impact. The paddle was used on the buttocks, the back, sometimes the soles of the feet. It caused deep bruising, intense pain, but usually didn't break the skin the way the whip did. A person beaten with a paddle might be unable to sit for days, might limp from the trauma to their legs and lower body, but would heal without the visible scarring that could complicate a future sale. There was a grotesque practicality to this. The paddle was considered a more moderate punishment, suitable for lesser offenses, for situations where the slaveholder wanted to cause pain without causing lasting visible damage. It was part of the graduated system of violence, the hierarchy of hurt that ranged from a slap to the whip to the brand to worse things still. The feet were a particular target. The practice of bastinado, beating the soles of the feet, was borrowed from other cultures and other eras, but found a home on American plantations. The feet have an extraordinary concentration of nerve endings. A beating there causes excruciating pain, but leaves little visible evidence once the initial swelling subsides. A person who'd been bastinadoed could barely walk for days, would wince at every step, but could be forced back to work as soon as they could stand. Their suffering would be largely invisible to casual observation. Some slaveholders became experts in this kind of calculated cruelty, developing techniques that maximized pain while minimizing the kind of damage that would show up in account books as reduced labor capacity. They knew exactly how hard to hit, exactly where, exactly how many times. They'd learned through practice, through experimentation, through the systematic torture of human beings treated as objects for refinement of technique. Then there was the collar. Iron collars were common punishments for runaways, for those who had attempted escape and been recaptured. These weren't simple neck rings. They were often fitted with extensions, prongs that jutted outward, making it impossible to lie down comfortably, making it difficult to move through underbrush or doorways, making the wearer constantly, painfully aware of their status. Some collars had bells attached, so that any movement would announce the wearer's location. The message was clear. You tried to run, and now you can never move in silence again. Your punishment follows you every moment. Even your sleep is constrained. Even your dreams are interrupted by the weight of iron around your neck. These collars were worn for weeks, sometimes months. The skin underneath would chafe and bleed. The weight would cause neck and shoulder pain that became chronic. And the psychological burden, the constant physical reminder of your attempted escape and subsequent capture, was designed to break not just the body but the will. We should talk about what happened in the darkness, because not all punishment happened in public. The daylight punishments, the whippings at the post, those were theatre designed for an audience. But some punishments happened in private, in outbuildings, in cellars, in spaces designed for the extended infliction of suffering away from witnesses. Some plantations had dedicated structures for this. They might be called the jail, or the correction house, or simply that building over there that everyone knew about and no one discussed. Inside, the tools were different, the time scale was different, the calculus was different. These were places for breaking people who hadn't been broken by standard methods, for punishing offences considered too severe for public handling, for doing things that even the system preferred to keep hidden. The historical record is incomplete about what happened in these spaces, partly because few survivors wrote about it, partly because the perpetrators had reasons to keep silent, partly because some things are simply too terrible to document. But we know they existed. We know people went in and came out changed. We know some people went in and never came out at all. Salt or brine or turpentine applied to open wounds was documented across multiple plantations. The official justification, when one was given, was that these substances promoted healing, prevented infection. The actual purpose was to extend the punishment, to turn the aftermath of whipping into its own separate torture. Imagine your back torn open by the lash and then having salt water poured into those wounds. Imagine the searing, burning agony as the salt found every raw nerve ending. Survivors described this as being whipped twice, the second whipping sometimes worse than the first. This was deliberate. This was refined. Someone, somewhere, had discovered that this particular combination of tortures produced a particular result, and the knowledge had spread from plantation to plantation, overseer to overseer, part of the shared expertise of the professional torturer class. They learned from each other. They innovated. They took pride in their techniques. Heat was another tool. On the mildest end, there was the practice of forcing someone to stand in the sun for hours. No shade, no water, no relief. The southern summer sun could be its own instrument of torture, causing dehydration, heat exhaustion, sunburn that blistered and peeled. On the more severe end, there were documented cases of coals, hot irons, and fire being used to punish, to mark, to terrorize. Cold was equally available. In winter, forcing someone to stand outside inadequately clothed, exposing them to rain or frost, could cause suffering that left no marks. Hypothermia, frostbite, the slow seeping cold that makes every joint ache and every muscle tense. These were punishments that the weather itself administered while overseers watched. Water punishments took many forms. The forced ingestion of massive quantities of water, the denial of water for dangerous periods, the practice of ducking or near drowning. These left no visible marks but caused intense suffering and fear. A person who has been held underwater until they're sure they're about to die carries that fear forever. The threat of it happening again becomes its own form of control. Here's what the slaveholders understood that we sometimes forget. The most effective punishments were often those that left no permanent marks. A whipped back told a story. Scarred flesh was evidence that could complicate things, could raise questions if the enslaved person was ever sold, could potentially be used against the slaveholder if the political winds ever shifted. But a beating that left only bruises that faded, a torture that left only psychological scars, a terror that couldn't be photographed or documented, these were in some ways more useful precisely because they were more deniable. This is partly why the psychological components of punishment became so refined. The threat of punishment could be almost as effective as the punishment itself, and it left no marks at all. Slaveholders learned to exploit anticipation, to make the waiting its own form of torture. You've done something wrong. Punishment is coming. But when? Today? Tomorrow? Next week? The uncertainty itself became a tool. Some slaveholders made a practice of announcing punishments well in advance. You will receive 30 lashes on Saturday. This gave the victim days to imagine what was coming. Days of fear and dread. Days when every moment was shadowed by knowledge of approaching pain. By the time Saturday arrived, the person had already suffered through their own imagination more times than they could count. The reverse technique was equally effective. Random, unpredictable punishment that could arrive at any moment for any reason. This kept everyone off balance, everyone watchful, everyone afraid. You never knew when lightning would strike, so you spent every moment prepared for the storm. The constant vigilance was exhausting. The fear was constant. The punishment was everywhere, even when it was nowhere. Family was both a source of strength and a point of vulnerability, and the system exploited this ruthlessly. Slaveholders quickly learned that the threat of hurting, selling, or separating family members was one of the most powerful tools of control available. You might endure any punishment yourself, might grit your teeth through the worst the whip could offer, but could you watch your child be whipped? Could you endure knowing that your resistance would result in your wife being sold south, your mother beaten, your brother worked to death? This was leverage, and slaveholders used it constantly. The threat didn't even need to be spoken out loud. Everyone knew that families could be separated, that loved ones could be sold, that defiance by one person could bring consequences for everyone they cared about. This knowledge hung over every interaction, every decision, every moment of every day. Some slaveholders made examples of families specifically to demonstrate this power. A man who ran away might return to find his wife had been whipped in his absence, punished for his transgression. A woman who resisted might watch her children separated and sold to different buyers, scattered across the South with no hope of reunion. These weren't just individual punishments. They were messages to the entire community. Your connections to each other are vulnerabilities we will exploit. The cruelty of this cannot be overstated. Human beings need connection. We need love, need family, need community. The slave system took this fundamental human need and weaponized it, turned the bonds between people into chains that bound them to compliance. Love became a liability. The deepest human connections became tools of control. And yet, people loved anyway. They formed families anyway, built communities anyway, maintained bonds of affection and loyalty that the system could exploit, but never fully sever. This is perhaps the most remarkable thing about the history of American slavery. Despite every effort to atomize, to isolate, to turn people into lone individuals with no connections that could sustain them, community persisted, love persisted, humanity persisted. The quarters, the cabins where enslaved people lived, became spaces of hidden community. What happened there after dark, when the overseers were in their houses and the big house had gone to sleep, was a different world from the one that existed in daylight. This was where songs were sung, where stories were told, where traditions were passed down, where people were simply themselves in ways that the daylight hours never permitted. These spaces weren't safe exactly. The overseer could arrive at any moment. A slaveholder might decide to make an inspection, to assert his power over even these private hours. But there was a relative privacy, a relative freedom. a chance to be something other than a laboring body under constant surveillance. Religion thrived in these spaces. The enslaved people's Christianity was different from their enslavers' Christianity, infused with African traditions, focused on liberation and deliverance, finding in the stories of Moses and the Israelites a template for their own hoped-for freedom. When they sang about crossing the Jordan, they meant more than a biblical river. When they prayed for deliverance, they meant more than spiritual salvation. The slaveholders tried to control religion too. They preferred versions of Christianity that emphasized obedience, that told slaves to be content with their lot, that promised rewards in heaven for suffering patiently on earth. Some slaveholders brought in preachers who would deliver these messages or delivered them themselves. Slaves, obey your masters. Servants, be subject to your masters with all fear. But enslaved people heard these messages and transformed them. They took the parts that served them, the stories of liberation and divine justice, and made them central. They heard about Moses leading his people out of Egypt and understood exactly who Pharaoh was in their own story. They heard about the walls of Jericho coming down and imagined other walls falling. The religion meant to pacify them became a source of hope and resistance. Music was similarly dual purpose. The work songs sung in the fields served multiple functions. They helped coordinate labor, set rhythm, made the endless hours of work more bearable. But they also carried coded messages, preserved traditions, maintained a form of communication that the overseers couldn't fully understand or control. When an enslaved person sang about following the drinking gourd, they might be passing along instructions for escape, information about routes and safe houses, intelligence that could save lives. The system tried to control this too, of course. Some plantations banned certain songs, suspicious of lyrics that seemed to carry hidden meanings. But you can't really police singing when singing is part of work, when the rhythm of songs makes labor more efficient. And you especially can't police meaning. The same words could be innocent or revolutionary depending on how they were understood, and the enslaved people understood them in ways their enslavers never could. Every form of cultural preservation was a form of resistance. When parents taught their children the stories of their ancestors, the places they came from, the languages that had been spoken before English was imposed, they were maintaining something the system wanted to destroy. When families kept track of their genealogies, remembering relationships that the legal system refused to recognize, they were asserting their humanity against a system that denied it. When people gathered at night to worship, to sing, to simply be together as a community, they were reclaiming something that belonged to them. The punishments were designed to prevent all of this, to make resistance too dangerous, community too costly, hope too painful. But they failed. Over and over again, they failed. Not because the punishments weren't severe, they were. Not because people didn't suffer, they did, terribly. But because human beings are more resilient than any system expects, because the will to survive and to retain some core of self persists even under conditions designed to crush it. This doesn't minimize the suffering. Nothing minimizes the suffering. But it does honor the humanity of those who endured it, who found ways to live, and even moments of joy within a system designed to reduce them to laboring machines. They were never just victims. They were people, full and complex, with inner lives as rich as anyone's, exercising every form of agency available to them within conditions that allowed almost none. The sun continues its arc across the sky. The cotton waits. The overseer watches. But in your mind, in that space they can't reach, you're planning. Maybe planning is too strong a word, but you're thinking, you're remembering, you're imagining. Somewhere in the north you've heard, there are places where people like you are free. Somewhere there are communities of escaped slaves living openly. Somewhere the Underground Railroad runs, a network of safe houses and secret routes that have carried thousands to freedom. You don't know if you'll ever make that journey. The risks are enormous. The punishments for failed escape attempts are worse than anything you've already witnessed. But you know it's possible because you've heard the stories, passed from person to person in whispers after dark. Someone made it. Someone always makes it. And every person who makes it is proof that the system isn't absolute, that the chains can be broken, that the power that seems total is actually fragile. For now, you pick cotton. Your fingers move through the bowls with practiced efficiency. The motion so ingrained you could do it in your sleep. Probably have done it in your sleep. Dreams filled with the endless rouse, the endless labor, the endless sun. But your mind is elsewhere. Your mind is following the drinking gourd north, tracing routes you've only heard described, imagining what it would feel like to cross into a place where your body belongs to you. Maybe someday, maybe never. But the thought itself is resistance. The hope itself is something they cannot take. Let's talk about the particular cruelties reserved for women, because the system's violence was never gender neutral. Women on plantations faced everything that men faced. The whip, the brand, the collar, the stocks, all of it. But they also faced additional layers of vulnerability that the system exploited with the same cold calculation it applied to everything else. Women's bodies were doubly valuable to slaveholders. They were laborers, certainly, expected to work the same fields, process the same crops, perform the same grueling tasks as men. But they were also reproductive capacity. Every child an enslaved woman bore was another piece of property, more wealth for the slaveholder, more labor for the future. This created a particular horror. Women were simultaneously worked like machines and treated as breeding stock. Punishment for women had to navigate this dual exploitation. A whipping that damaged a woman's ability to bear children was a whipping that damaged the slaveholder's investment. So the system developed its accommodations, if you can call them that, without choking on the word. The holes dug in the ground for pregnant women, protecting the fetus while brutalizing the mother. The modifications to punishment schedules around pregnancy and childbirth. The cold calculations about when a woman could be returned to the fields after giving birth. None of this was mercy. It was property management. The same slaveholders who allowed women a few days' recovery after childbirth would sell those newborn children away without hesitation, if the price was right. The same system that protected fetuses in the womb would work those children to exhaustion once they were old enough to be useful. Every apparent accommodation was actually just another form of control. Sexual violence was endemic to the system, and it operated as its own form of punishment and control. Enslaved women had no legal protection from rape, no recourse when slaveholders or overseers or any white man chose to assault them. Their bodies were property, and property cannot refuse its owner. This constant vulnerability was itself a form of terror, a daily reality that shaped every interaction between enslaved women and the white men who had power over them. Some slaveholders kept what they called fancy girls, enslaved women held specifically for sexual exploitation. Some overseers extracted sexual compliance as the price for not whipping, not reporting, not making life even worse than it already was. Some white women, wives of slaveholders, took their rage at their husband's infidelity out on the enslaved women who had been victimized, adding another layer of punishment to an already unbearable situation. The children born of these assaults occupied a particular limbo. They were often visibly mixed race, evidence of what had happened that everyone could see, but no one would officially acknowledge. They might be treated differently by the slaveholder, sometimes with a twisted form of preference, sometimes with increased brutality, as if their very existence was an accusation. They might be sold away specifically because their presence was uncomfortable, because they reminded everyone of things that polite Southern society pretended didn't happen. For enslaved mothers, watching their children grow up in this system was its own ongoing torture. Every day brought fresh awareness that you could not protect them, that the power you had as a parent was nothing compared to the power the system held over all of you. You couldn't keep them from being punished. You couldn't keep them from being sold. You couldn't even guarantee that they would know who you were, who their family was, where they came from. Some mothers taught their children survival. They taught them how to read white people's moods, how to avoid attention, how to navigate the countless small dangers of plantation life. They taught them which overseers were most dangerous, which tasks were least supervised, which routes through the property offered the most cover. They taught them the songs that carried hidden meanings, the stories that preserved forbidden history. Other mothers made the heartbreaking calculation that their children would be better off without attachment. If separation was inevitable, maybe it hurt less if the bonds were never fully formed. This was its own form of psychological damage, a survival strategy that protected against one wound by inflicting another. The system forced these impossible choices on people every day. Children, of course, were not exempt from punishment themselves. The system needed each new generation to be broken in, to learn the rules, to understand viscerally what disobedience would cost. A child's first whipping was an initiation, a boundary marker between whatever childhood was possible and the harsh reality of what their life would be. The punishments for children were sometimes calibrated to their size, smaller whips, fewer strokes, the logic of an investment extending to the youngest members of the labor force. But sometimes they weren't calibrated at all. Sometimes children were made examples precisely because their suffering was so affecting, so impossible to watch, so effective at terrorizing everyone who witnessed it. The narratives of formerly enslaved people are filled with memories of childhood punishment, both their own and others. These memories were formative in the most literal sense, shaping who people became, what they believed about the world, what they thought was possible. A child who watched their parent whipped learned something about power that no words could teach. A child who was beaten for running too slowly learned something about their own body's status that shaped every day afterward. And yet children also played. They found moments of joy, invented games, formed friendships, experienced childhood despite the system's attempts to take it from them. In the margins of exploitation, in the brief hours when labor wasn't required, children did what children everywhere do. They laughed, they pretended, they made worlds within the world they'd been given. Former enslaved people sometimes describe these childhood games with a mixture of warmth and pain. Warmth because the memories were real, because joy existed even in that place. Pain because the joy was always temporary, always bounded, always subject to interruption by the horn, the overseer, the sudden intrusion of the system into whatever small space of freedom had been carved out. Some children's games were rehearsals for the work that awaited them, playing at picking cotton, mimicking the movements of field labor, turning survival skills into play. Other games were escapes, fantasies, imagined worlds where the rules were different. Both kinds served purposes. Both kinds helped children become people who could survive. Let's move through a day on the plantation, because punishment wasn't a separate event that happened occasionally. It was woven into the fabric of every hour, present even when it wasn't being actively administered. The thread of it shaped everything. The memory of it colored everything. There was no time when violence was entirely absent from the calculation of how to live. You wake before dawn because the horn tells you to wake. This is non-negotiable. The sound cuts through whatever sleep you've managed, and your body responds before your mind fully engages. You're upright, you're moving. You're preparing for the day because the alternative is unthinkable. Being late, being slow, being anything other than ready when ready is expected. These are punishable. So you're ready. The morning meal, if you can call it a meal, is brief. Whatever food you have, cornmeal probably, maybe some vegetables from your small garden if you've been allowed one, maybe some scraps from the big house kitchen. You eat quickly because there's no time for anything else, because lingering over food is a luxury that belongs to other people. The nutrition is insufficient for the labor that's expected, but insufficient nutrition is part of the system too. Keep people hungry enough to be controllable, but not so hungry they collapse in the fields. Then work, the walk to the fields, the distribution of tools, the beginning of another day that will look exactly like yesterday and exactly like tomorrow. Cotton doesn't care what day it is. The plants need what they need, and you're the mechanism by which those needs are met. Your fingers, your back, your legs, your endurance, these are inputs into an economic process that you'll never benefit from. The overseer is present, maybe on horseback, surveying the rows from above, maybe on foot, walking between the workers, watching for any slackening of pace, any insufficient effort. His presence is a constant calculation in your peripheral vision. Where is he? Is he looking this way? Can you slow down for a moment, rest your aching back, wipe the sweat from your eyes? Or is any pause going to be noted, remembered, added to an invisible ledger of offenses that might one day be called in? This is what constant surveillance does to the mind. Every action is weighed not just for its own sake, but for how it might appear, how it might be interpreted, how it might be used against you. You develop a second consciousness, always watching yourself from the outside, always monitoring your own performance. This is exhausting in ways that the physical labor alone doesn't account for. The sun climbs. The heat builds. Cotton bolls are full and heavy, and picking them requires a particular motion, a particular grip, a particular rhythm that you've internalized completely. Your hands know what to do. Your mind can wander, except it can't. Not really, because wandering attention means slowing down, and slowing down means consequences. At midday, there might be a break, some water, some rest in whatever shade is available. Maybe more food, though probably not much. The break is calibrated to maintain productivity, long enough to prevent collapse, short enough to maximize the hours of labor. Even rest is a management decision made by others. The afternoon stretches. Your body moves beyond tiredness into some other state, a mechanical persistence that feels separate from conscious experience. You're working, but you're also somewhere else, some part of you absent from the immediate moment, conserving something for later. This dissociation is a survival mechanism. It's how people endure the unendurable. As the sun finally begins to descend, the end of the workday approaches. But ending isn't clean or simple. There are quotas. Each person is expected to have picked a certain amount of cotton, and that amount will be weighed. Fall short, and there are consequences. Exactly what those consequences are varies from plantation to plantation, overseer to overseer, day to day. Sometimes a warning, sometimes a reduction in rations, sometimes the whip. The weighing is its own ritual of fear. You line up. Your cotton is placed on the scale. A number is recorded. And you wait, watching the overseer's face, trying to read whether today's amount is acceptable or whether you've failed somehow, whether punishment is coming. If you've met the quota, you're released to whatever evening remains. If you haven't, what happens next depends on factors you can't control. The overseer's mood, the slaveholder's current priorities, whether someone else's shortfall was worse than yours, whether any example needs to be made. You stand there waiting to learn your fate, your body exhausted, your mind calculating and recalculating, trying to guess which way this will go. Let's say today you're lucky. Today the number is acceptable. You're released. You walk back to the quarters, every step an effort, your body announcing its exhaustion in ways you've learned to ignore. There's more work waiting, probably. Personal tasks, maintaining your living space, preparing whatever food you have, tending to children if you have them. The work is never done. But the overseer isn't watching now, and that absence is the closest thing to freedom the day offers. In the quarters, life happens. People talk carefully, aware that conversation can be overheard, that certain topics are dangerous. People share what they have, extending the meager resources of the community across its members. People check on the sick, on the elderly, on those who were punished recently and are still recovering. This mutual care is resistance in its own form, a refusal of the atomization the system wants. As darkness falls, the relative privacy of night arrives. What happens now, in these hours between the end of work and the next morning's horn, is not entirely within the system's control. People pray, people sing, people tell stories, people love each other in whatever ways they can, maintaining the relationships that give life meaning. People plan. The planning is dangerous and necessary. Maybe it's just planning for tomorrow, how to get through another day. Maybe it's planning for next week, how to stretch the rations, how to manage a particular threat from a particular overseer. Maybe it's something bigger, something whispered between trusted people, something that could change everything or get everyone killed. Somewhere in the night, someone is thinking about running, maybe actively planning, maybe just imagining, maybe just allowing themselves to consider the possibility before pushing it away as too dangerous. But the thought exists. It's being thought right now, on this plantation, and on thousands of others across the South. The Underground Railroad is not just a network of routes and safe houses. It's a network of thoughts, dreams, plans that travel from mind to mind in the darkness. The night passes. Sleep comes eventually, though never enough, never as deep or restful as bodies this exhausted need. And then, before you're ready, the horn sounds again. Another day, another set of calculations, another navigation of a system designed to extract everything from you while giving nothing back. This is the rhythm. Day after day, year after year, generation after generation. The punishments, dramatic and documented, are just the peaks of a landscape of constant violence. The ordinary terror, the everyday fear, the background radiation of brutality that shaped every moment. This is what made the system work. The whippings were spectacular. The daily grind was total. But even within this totalizing system, people found ways to live. They found small pleasures, moments of beauty, connections that sustained them. They found ways to maintain their humanity against a system designed to strip it away. This isn't a contradiction of the horror. It's what human beings do. We persist, we adapt, we find light in darkness, and sometimes, against all odds, we escape. The escapes were rare but real. Every successful flight was proof that the system wasn't absolute, that the power that seemed total had gaps, weaknesses, vulnerabilities. The people who made it to freedom became symbols for everyone who remained behind. If one person could do it, maybe another could. Maybe someday you. Harriet Tubman made her escape and then went back. Not once, but repeatedly, leading dozens of people to freedom along routes she'd memorized, through dangers she'd already survived. She became Moses to her people, a living embodiment of the possibility of liberation. The bounty on her head grew to $40,000, an astronomical sum that testified to how dangerous the slaveholders considered her. Not just for the people she led out, but for the hope she represented to everyone who remained. Other conductors on the Underground Railroad, less famous but equally brave, performed similar miracles. White abolitionists, free black people, even some who remained enslaved themselves, all participated in this network of resistance. They hid people in cellars and attics, guided them along safe routes, transported them in wagons under false bottoms, provided them with forged papers and disguises. Every act of assistance was illegal, punishable, dangerous. People did it anyway. The punishments for those caught helping escaped slaves were severe. The punishments for escaped slaves who were recaptured were worse. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made the entire country complicit, requiring citizens in free states to assist in the capture and return of escaped slaves. Running away became more dangerous than ever, with bounty hunters operating legally throughout the North, with federal commissioners paid more for returning people to slavery than for setting them free. And still people ran. And still some of them made it. And everyone who made it was another crack in the system's facade of total control. Now let's talk about the law, because one of the most insidious aspects of plantation punishment was that it was legal. Entirely, thoroughly, officially sanctioned by courts, constitutions, and legislatures. The violence wasn't happening in spite of the law. It was happening because of the law, under the law's protection, with the law's active assistance. Slave codes varied from state to state, but they shared common features across the South. They defined enslaved people as property, not persons. They gave slaveholders nearly unlimited authority over their property. They criminalized resistance, escape, literacy, assembly, and dozens of other activities that free people took for granted. They created a separate legal universe in which the normal rules of human society simply didn't apply. Under these codes, a slaveholder could legally whip an enslaved person for almost any reason. The codes sometimes specified limits, theoretically prohibiting punishment that resulted in death or permanent disfigurement, but these limits were rarely enforced. Courts were reluctant to interfere with property rights. Juries were composed of slaveholders and those sympathetic to them. The legal system was not a check on plantation violence. It was an enabler. When cases did reach the courts, the results were illuminating. A slaveholder might be fined for killing an enslaved person, but the fine was typically modest, a fraction of what the person had been worth as property. The death of a slave was a property crime, not a murder. The punishment reflected the value of what had been destroyed, not the life that had been taken. Some legal cases explicitly defended the right to brutalize enslaved people. In the infamous State v. Mann decision of 1829, a North Carolina court ruled that a slaveholder could not be criminally liable for assaulting an enslaved person he had rented. The power of the master must be absolute, the judge wrote, to render the submission of the slave perfect. This was the law speaking, not a rogue slaveholder, not an unusually cruel overseer, but the official legal system of the United States declaring that absolute power and perfect submission were the goals, and that violence in pursuit of those goals was protected. The law also facilitated punishment by regulating every aspect of enslaved people's lives. Passes were required to travel, so anyone caught without proper documentation could be punished or returned to their owner. Assembly was restricted, so any gathering of enslaved people without white supervision was illegal. Teaching enslaved people to read or write was criminalized, so the pursuit of literacy, that most human of activities, became a punishable offense. This last prohibition deserves special attention. The slaveholders understood that literacy was power. Reading opened access to information, to the arguments of abolitionists, to the news of the world beyond the plantation. Writing allowed communication, coordination, the creation of records. An enslaved population that could read and write was an enslaved population that was harder to control, harder to deceive, harder to keep isolated. So they made it illegal. In state after state, laws were passed criminalizing the education of enslaved people. The punishments were severe for those who taught as well as those who learned. Teachers could be fined, imprisoned, attacked by mobs. Enslaved people caught learning could be whipped, sold, or worse. And yet, people learned anyway. They stole books, hid lessons, taught each other in secret. Frederick Douglass learned to read from the white children he played with, then continued his education in stolen moments, hidden from suspicious eyes. Others learned from literate enslaved people who passed on what they knew despite the risk. The hunger for education was so strong that it survived legal prohibition, survived the threat of punishment, survived the system's best efforts to stamp it out. Every enslaved person who learned to read was committing a revolutionary act. Every book hidden in the quarters was contraband more dangerous, in the slaveholders' minds, than weapons. The pen wasn't just mightier than the sword, it was mightier than the whip, and they knew it. Let's talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough: the role of medicine and medical authority in the system of punishment. Doctors in the antebellum South weren't just healers. They were often collaborators in the maintenance of slavery, providing scientific-sounding justifications for brutality, and sometimes participating directly in the torture of enslaved people. The medical profession developed theories of racial difference that conveniently supported the slave system. Black bodies were declared to be fundamentally different from white bodies, stronger, less sensitive to pain, better suited for labor, requiring less rest and nourishment. These theories had no scientific basis, but they provided comfortable rationalizations for working people to exhaustion, for providing inadequate food and shelter, for punishing people in ways that would be considered cruel if applied to anyone recognized as fully human. Some doctors went further, using enslaved people as subjects for medical experimentation. J. Marion Sims, often called the father of modern gynecology, developed his surgical techniques by operating on enslaved women without anesthesia. He performed the same experimental procedure on one woman, Anarcha, at least 30 times before he perfected it. The women had no ability to consent or refuse. Their suffering was simply the cost of medical progress, absorbed by their bodies, benefiting others. Other medical experiments of the period used enslaved people to test treatments, study diseases, and practice procedures. The lack of consent was not considered a problem. These were not patients but property, and property could be used as the owner saw fit. If the owner agreed to allow experimentation, that was sufficient. The person being experimented on had no legal voice, no right to refuse. This medical complicity extended to the aftermath of punishment. Doctors were sometimes called in to treat people who had been whipped, to ensure they would survive and return to productivity. These same doctors rarely questioned the punishments themselves. rarely advocated for mercy, rarely used whatever authority they had to reduce the violence. They were technicians, keeping the machinery running, patching up the damage so the labor could continue. The intersection of medicine and slavery reveals something important about how the system worked. It wasn't just individual cruelty, though there was plenty of that. It was institutional, professional, normalized. The most educated people in Southern society, the doctors and lawyers and ministers, found ways to accommodate themselves to slavery, to provide it with justifications and assistance. The system corrupted everyone it touched. The churches were no exception. Southern Christianity developed its own theology of slavery, one that found biblical support for the peculiar institution, that preached obedience to enslaved people and benevolence to their owners, that spiritualized the relationship between master and slave as something holy rather than horrific. Ministers who might have been expected to cry out against the violence instead blessed it, sanctified it, provided it with religious cover. The message preached to enslaved people was consistent. Obey your masters. Serve faithfully. Accept your lot in this life and trust in rewards in the next. Suffering was sanctifying. Resistance was sin. God had placed you where you were for reasons you couldn't understand but should accept. Some enslaved people rejected this message entirely. Others absorbed parts of it, while transforming others, finding in Christianity a vision of liberation that contradicted the slave theology being imposed on them. They saw themselves not as servants who should obey, but as children of God, who were being wrongly held in bondage. They identified with the Israelites in Egypt, not with the servants to whom Paul wrote. They believed in a God of justice who would eventually set things right. This theological resistance was as real and as important as physical resistance. It provided a framework for understanding their situation that countered the narrative being pushed by their oppressors. It gave people a sense of dignity and worth that the system tried to strip away. It kept hope alive when hope seemed irrational. The secret church gatherings, the brush arbor meetings held in clearings deep in the woods, the prayers whispered in the darkness of the quarters. These were acts of spiritual rebellion. People were worshipping in ways they weren't supposed to worship, believing things they weren't supposed to believe, maintaining a religious life that belonged to them, rather than being controlled by their enslavers. Now, let's return to the body, because in the end, that's what the punishment system was about. Bodies. Controlling them, exploiting them, breaking them, and extracting every possible hour of labor from them before they wore out. The toll on bodies was visible everywhere. The stooped backs of older workers, bent from decades of field labor, the scarred skin that told stories of past punishments, the missing fingers from accidents with machinery, accidents that happen because exhausted people make mistakes and the system didn't pause for exhaustion. The hernias, the chronic pain, the worn joints, the accumulated damage of doing too much work with too little rest and too little food for too many years. Life expectancy for enslaved people was significantly lower than for free people, even free black people in the North. The work killed. Not dramatically usually, not all at once, but slowly, grinding down bodies that were never given time to fully recover. A person might survive into old age, but what kind of old age? What kind of body would be left after 30, 40, 50 years of this labor and this treatment? The slaveholders understood this too. They knew that enslaved people wore out, that the labor force had to be constantly replenished. This is partly why they valued women's reproductive capacity so highly. It's partly why the domestic slave trade became such a massive industry, moving hundreds of thousands of people from the Upper South to the Deep South as the cotton economy expanded. Fresh bodies were always needed because the system destroyed bodies at a consistent rate. Children born into slavery were condemned to the same fate. From the moment of birth, their labor was anticipated, their value calculated. A healthy infant represented future work, future productivity, future exploitation. They would be put to small tasks as soon as they were able, graduated to harder work as they grew, worked until their bodies broke just like their parents before them. The intergenerational nature of this violence is almost incomprehensible. It wasn't just that individuals suffered. It was that families suffered, communities suffered, generations suffered. The trauma passed from parent to child, embedded in bodies, embedded in minds, embedded in the very fabric of the community. And the profits accumulated in other families, other communities, other hands that never touched cotton, but built their wealth on those who did. We should name that clearly, because it's essential to understanding what plantation punishment really was. It wasn't just a disciplinary system. It was an economic system. Every whip stroke was connected to a balance sheet. Every hour of labor extracted was profit in someone else's pocket. The cotton picked by enslaved hands bought mansions in Charleston, educated children at Harvard, funded banks in New York, built textile mills in Massachusetts. The entire American economy was implicated. Northern merchants shipped Southern cotton to European markets. Northern banks financed slave purchases and plantation operations. Northern manufacturers turned cotton into cloth. The profits of slavery weren't contained in the South. They flowed throughout the nation, building infrastructure, funding institutions, creating the wealth that would make America an industrial power. This is what the punishment system protected. Not just individual slaveholders' power over individual enslaved people, but an entire economic order that depended on forced labor. The whip wasn't arbitrary. It was the enforcement mechanism for a system of extraction that made some people very rich and other people very dead. Every punishment was ultimately about maintaining this economic arrangement, keeping the labor flowing, keeping the cotton growing, keeping the profits accumulating. And when the system finally ended, when the Civil War and the 13th Amendment formally abolished slavery, what happened to all that accumulated wealth? It stayed where it was. The slaveholders lost their human property, but they kept their land, their houses, their political power, their social position. The formerly enslaved people were freed into nothing. No land, no money, no resources, no reparations for generations of stolen labor. The punishment didn't end either, not really. It transformed. The black codes emerged almost immediately, criminalizing unemployment and vagrancy, creating pretext to arrest free black people and force them into labor through the convict leasing system. The chain gangs, the prison farms, the forced labor that looked remarkably like slavery and accomplished remarkably similar purposes. The whip was traded for other weapons, but the violence continued. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We're still in 1842, still in the thick of the system at its height. The sun has set. The quarters are quiet, or as quiet as they get. Tomorrow will bring more of the same labor, the same surveillance, the same ever-present threat of punishment for real or imagined offenses. You lie in the darkness and think about the people you've lost, sold away, worked to death, killed outright. You carry them with you, their names, their faces, the way they laughed, the things they taught you. The system wants you to forget, wants each person to be isolated in an eternal present without history or connection. But you remember. Remembering is its own resistance. You think about the people you still have, the family in the next cabin, the friends in the fields, the community that sustains you despite everything designed to tear it apart. These connections are what make survival possible, what makes survival meaningful. The system can take so much, but it can't take the fact that you love and are loved, that you matter to someone, that your existence means something beyond your labor. You think about the future, whatever future might be possible, your children, if you have them, and what their lives might be. The hope, fragile but persistent, that somehow things might change. The faith, tested daily and never quite extinguished, that this isn't the end of the story. Outside, the night is full of sounds, insects, animals, the wind in the trees. Somewhere, someone is singing quietly, a song that sounds like a lullaby, but might be something else. The overseers think they control the night, but they don't, not really. In the darkness, things happen that they'll never know about. Plans are made, knowledge is passed, hope is maintained. The stars wheel overhead, the same stars that hang over free soil in the north, over the ocean that brought your ancestors to this place, over Africa itself, that homeland most of you will never see, but none of you have forgotten. The stars don't care about slavery. They keep their courses regardless of what happens below. But looking at them, you can imagine that somewhere, someone is looking at the same stars and thinking about you. You're connected to something larger than this plantation, this moment, this system that wants to be your whole world. Tomorrow the horn will sound. Tomorrow the cycle will begin again. But tonight, in this darkness, you are more than property. You are a person with a past and a future, with loves and losses, with dreams and determination. The system denies this every waking hour, but it can't reach into your mind, can't take what you know about yourself, can't erase the truth that outlasts every lie. This is how people survived, not by being superhuman, but by being fully human in conditions designed to deny their humanity, by loving when love was dangerous, by hoping when hope seemed foolish, by remembering when forgetting would have been easier, by maintaining some kernel of self that no whip could touch. Let's talk about what happened when someone did fight back, because it happened. Not often, not usually, but sometimes people reached a limit, a point beyond which they would not be pushed, and they resisted with their bodies, their fists, sometimes with weapons. The consequences were predictable and severe. Physical resistance to a white person, any white person, but especially an overseer or slaveholder, was treated as one of the gravest offenses possible. The punishment was designed to be so extreme that it would deter anyone else from attempting the same thing. A person who struck back might be whipped nearly to death, might be branded, might be sold south to even harsher conditions, might simply be killed outright as an example. And yet people still did it. The historical record contains cases of enslaved people who refused to be whipped, who fought overseers, who in some cases killed their tormentors. These acts were usually fatal for the person who committed them, but they happened anyway. At some point, for some people, death became preferable to continued submission. Frederick Douglass wrote powerfully about his own turning point, a fight with a slave breaker named Covey. Douglass had been sent to Covey specifically to have his spirit broken, and for months it worked. The constant labor, the constant abuse, the constant violence reduced him to something barely human, as he described it. But one day, something snapped. He fought back. The fight lasted hours. Covey couldn't beat Douglass, and Douglass wouldn't submit. Eventually, Covey gave up. He never tried to whip Douglass again. And Douglass wrote that this fight was the turning point of his life as a slave, the moment when he reclaimed something essential that had been taken from him. He was still enslaved, still legally property, still subject to all the constraints of the system. But something had changed inside him. He had proven to himself more than anyone that he was not entirely powerless. This kind of resistance was rare because it was so dangerous, but its possibility haunted the slaveholders. They knew that they were outnumbered. They knew that the people they brutalized might, at any moment, decide that the risk of fighting back was worth taking. This fear shaped everything about how they managed their human property. The threat of collective resistance was even more terrifying. The Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831 sent shockwaves through the entire South. Turner and his followers killed approximately 60 white people before being suppressed. The response was massive and hysterical, with white mobs killing enslaved people throughout the region, many of whom had nothing to do with the rebellion. Laws were tightened. Surveillance was increased. The punishment system became even more brutal. But Turner's ghost haunted the slaveholders for the rest of the antebellum period. Every gathering of enslaved people was potentially dangerous. Every enslaved person was a potential rebel. The system knew its own vulnerability, and its response was more violence, more control, more punishment. The rebellion was crushed, but the fear it created never went away. Other conspiracies, real and imagined, produced similar responses. Denmark Vesey's planned uprising in Charleston in 1822. Gabriel Prosser's conspiracy in Virginia in 1800. Every revelation or rumor of organized resistance led to waves of punishment, torture of suspected conspirators, executions designed to terrify everyone who remained. The system's brutality was, in part, a response to its own fear. This fear was not irrational. The slaveholders were doing something monstrous, and they knew it, no matter how many justifications they constructed. They were holding millions of people in bondage through violence, extracting their labor, treating them as animals. The people they victimized had every reason to rise up, and only the most comprehensive system of terror kept them from doing so. The violence wasn't incidental to slavery. It was slavery's essential foundation. Let's return to the fields one more time, because understanding the punishment system requires understanding the labor it enforced. Cotton was king in the Deep South, and cotton cultivation was brutally demanding work. The planting, the hoeing, the endless picking during harvest season, all of it required backbreaking effort sustained over long hours in difficult conditions. The picking itself deserves attention. Cotton bolls are surrounded by sharp husks that cut fingers and hands. The work requires constant bending, reaching, moving through rows that seem to stretch forever. Each person was expected to pick a certain amount each day, and that amount was not negotiable. Fall short, and punishment followed. Exceed the expectation, and your new amount became the standard you'd be held to going forward. The physical toll of picking was relentless. Your fingers, after weeks and months and years of this work, became calloused and scarred. The skin thickened and cracked from constant contact with the sharp edges of cotton bolls. Blood was common, especially early on before the calluses formed, your hands leaving small red stains on the white cotton that you'd have to pick around, that you'd hope no one would notice. The bending, hour after hour, day after day, destroyed backs. People in their 30s moved like people in their 60s, their spines curved, their muscles knotted, their bodies aged decades beyond their years. The heat was its own punishment. Summer in the Deep South, with the sun beating down on fields that offered no shade, temperatures climbing past 100 degrees, humidity so thick you felt like you were breathing water. Sweat soaked through clothes within the first hour and stayed that way until nightfall. Heat exhaustion was common. Heat stroke killed people. And yet the work continued because the cotton didn't care about the weather, and neither did the people who profited from it. Your bag grew heavier as the day progressed. You dragged it behind you down the rows, the weight increasing with every handful of cotton, the strap cutting into your shoulder, your whole body aching from the combination of bending and pulling, and the relentless accumulation of what you'd picked. By afternoon, that bag might weigh 50 pounds, 70 pounds, more. You dragged it like a physical manifestation of everything the system demanded from you. This created an impossible situation. Work as hard as you could, and you'd be expected to maintain that pace indefinitely. Work as hard as you could, and you'd be expected to maintain that pace indefinitely. Fail to meet expectations, and you'd be punished. There was no winning, no way to satisfy the system's demands, while also preserving your own body and health. The calculation was always, how much can I get away with? How little can I appear to do while still avoiding the whip? Enslaved people became experts at working within this system. They developed techniques for appearing busy while conserving energy. They learned to read overseers' patterns, knowing when they could slow down and when they needed to appear maximally productive. They helped each other, the faster pickers sometimes adding to the baskets of slower ones, spreading the risk of punishment across the community. This was resistance too, even if it didn't look dramatic. Every ounce of energy conserved was energy not given to the system. Every moment of rest stolen under the overseer's nose was a small victory. The slaveholders wanted total extraction, wanted every drop of labor that could possibly be squeezed from human bodies. The enslaved people found ways to hold something back, to maintain some margin for themselves. Sabotage was another form of resistance that operated in the shadows. Tools that broke mysteriously, crops that somehow didn't yield as expected, machinery that malfunctioned at critical moments. These incidents were difficult to trace, difficult to punish because it was hard to prove they were deliberate. But they added up, creating friction in the smooth operation of the plantation economy. Animals might be mistreated in ways that reduced their usefulness. Buildings might be allowed to deteriorate. Knowledge might be withheld. Enslaved people who understood the work better than their overseers, keeping that expertise to themselves, except when it benefited them. The slaveholders depended on enslaved people's skills and knowledge, and that dependency was itself a source of hidden power. Feigning illness was a constant negotiation. Everyone got sick sometimes, but how sick was sick enough to be excused from work? The penalties for malingering were severe, so claiming illness was always a risk. But the penalties for working while truly sick were also severe, as your body broke down faster and your productive life shortened. People learned to calibrate their claims, to know when they could successfully argue for a day's rest and when it wasn't worth the risk. Women sometimes used pregnancy in this calculus, though it was a double-edged strategy. Pregnant women might be given somewhat lighter duties, might be excused from the most grueling work, but they were also producing the next generation of enslaved laborers, adding to the slaveholders' wealth, while their own bodies bore the cost. There was no good option, only less bad ones. The elderly occupied a particular position. Their bodies had been used up by the system, but they still had value as teachers, as childcare providers, as repositories of knowledge and memory. An older person who could no longer work the fields might be assigned to watch children, allowing younger adults to labor more hours. Or they might simply be cast aside, their usefulness exhausted, left to survive as best they could on whatever the community could spare. Children transitioned into labor gradually, their tasks increasing as their bodies grew capable of more. A child of 5 might be assigned to carry water, to run messages, to do light work around the quarters. By 10 or 12, they'd be in the fields with everyone else. By their mid-teens, they'd be doing the full work expected of adults, their childhood effectively over. This gradual incorporation was another form of conditioning, teaching children what their lives would be, breaking them in before they fully understood what was happening. By the time they were old enough to question, the patterns were already set, the body already trained, the mind already shaped by years of this reality. And through all of this, the punishment system loomed. It was the enforcer, the guarantor, the ever-present threat that made everything else possible. Without the violence, without the certainty that resistance would be met with overwhelming force, the entire system would have collapsed. The slaveholders knew this. The enslaved people knew it too. But knowing something isn't the same as accepting it. The knowledge that they were trapped didn't stop people from dreaming of freedom, planning for escape, hoping for change. The punishment system was powerful, but it wasn't omnipotent. It couldn't reach into minds. It couldn't control thoughts. It couldn't extinguish the fundamental human desire for liberty that burned in every person it tried to suppress. The dawn is coming now. You can see the sky lightening through the cracks in the cabin walls. Soon the horn will sound, and another day will begin. You've made it through another night. That's something. That's not nothing. Every day survived is a small victory over a system that would be perfectly happy to work you to death and replace you with someone else. You rise. You prepare. You step outside into the morning air, already warm, already promising another day of heat and labor and watchfulness. Around you, others are doing the same, emerging from their cabins, stretching muscles that never fully recover, facing a day that will look like yesterday and tomorrow, and every other day, until something changes. But here's the thing about that sameness. It wasn't forever. It felt like forever. It was designed to feel like forever. But it wasn't. The system that seemed so permanent, so absolute, so thoroughly embedded in law and economy and culture that it could never be challenged, that system fell. It took a war, it took blood, it took suffering beyond measure, but it fell. The people who endured what you've experienced tonight, the whippings and the brands and the constant terror, many of them lived to see emancipation. They walked off plantations as free people. They searched for family members who had been sold away. They built churches and schools and communities. They voted and held office and participated in democracy, at least until that too was stripped away by the long backlash that followed. Their survival was not just individual. It was collective, generational, historical. What they endured and how they endured it shaped everything that came after. The culture they preserved, the faith they maintained, the resistance they practiced in 1,000 small ways. All of this became the foundation for movements that would transform America. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, in your own bed, in your own time, carry with you the weight of what you've heard, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. This history isn't comfortable, but it's real, and it's part of who we are as a nation, all of us. The wealth that built this country, the labor that made America an economic power, the suffering that underlaid the prosperity so many take for granted, this is the foundation we stand on. And carry with you also the humanity of the people who endured this. They were not abstractions. They were not symbols. They were people with names and faces and dreams, people who loved and laughed and hoped despite everything. The system wanted to reduce them to units of labor, to entries in ledger books, to bodies whose only value was their productivity. But they were more than that. They were always more than that. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, maybe whisper a quiet thank you to those ancestors, whether they're your ancestors by blood or simply by shared humanity. Thank them for surviving what shouldn't have been survivable. Thank them for preserving what the system tried to destroy. Thank them for maintaining hope when hope seemed foolish, for loving when love was dangerous, for dreaming of freedom when freedom seemed impossible. They ran so that you could rest. They suffered so that future generations might live without suffering. They held onto their humanity so fiercely that even centuries of violence couldn't extinguish it. And their courage echoes still, in every fight for justice, in every refusal to accept cruelty as normal, in every insistence that human beings deserve to be treated as human beings. The story doesn't end with slavery's abolition. The echoes of this violence reverberate through American history, through Jim Crow and lynching and segregation and mass incarceration, through struggles that continue to this day. Understanding what you've heard tonight is part of understanding where we are now, how we got here, what work remains to be done. But that's for another night. For now, let go of the weight. Let go of the horror. Keep the humanity, the resilience, the stubborn insistence on survival that defined those who endured. Let their strength be part of your rest. Close your eyes. Breathe slowly. Feel the comfort of your own bed, your own safety, your own freedom to simply lie here without fear. These are not small things. These are precious things. They were bought with suffering you can barely imagine, and they should never be taken for granted. The night is quiet now. The history has been told. Somewhere in the past, someone is waking to the horn's call, facing another day of labor and watchfulness. Somewhere in the past, someone is being tied to a whipping post, preparing to endure what must be endured. Somewhere in the past, someone is lying in darkness just like you, dreaming of a future where their grandchildren might sleep in peace. That future is now. You are the dream they dreamed. Rest well in it. Good night.